Ford just posted one of its best earnings quarters in years. Wall Street upgraded the stock. Analysts are raising price targets. And yet, right now, more Ford owners are getting recall notices in the mail than at almost any point in the company's history. Something doesn't add up. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what's really happening inside Ford. Because here's the strange truth. If you only looked at Ford's stock chart this year, you would think everything is fine. Better than fine, actually. Shares are up double digits. The company just raised its full-year profit guidance. Analysts who were lukewarm on Ford a few months ago are now telling investors to buy. But if you only looked at the other side of the story, the side that shows up in owner mailboxes and dealership service bays and federal safety databases, you would think this company is falling apart. Millions of vehicles recalled. Record after record being broken, and not the good kind. Seats that can recline on their own with someone sitting in the back seat. Cameras that go dark. Brakes on trailers that stop working mid-tow. This is not a small problem. This is one of the largest and most persistent waves of recalls any American automaker has ever produced. And it is happening at the exact same time the company is telling investors that business has never been better. So which one is true? Is Ford thriving, or is Ford quietly falling apart behind a very good-looking earnings report? The answer, as it usually is with a company this size, is both. And once you understand how both of these things can be true at the same time, you will understand something much bigger about how modern car companies actually work, why quality problems and profit growth are not the contradiction they appear to be, and why this matters to you whether you drive a Ford, you're thinking about buying one, or you just want to understand what is really going on with one of the most iconic names in American manufacturing. Let's start with the number that should stop you in your tracks. Ford has recalled more than 11 million vehicles in 2026 alone, and the year is not even finished. 11 million. That is not a typo, and it is not a one-time event caused by a single defective part. It is the result of dozens of separate recall actions, each one covering hundreds of thousands, or in some cases, millions of vehicles, stacking on top of each other month after month. This year alone, the company has filed roughly 50 separate recall notices with federal safety regulators. 50. Think about that pace. That is close to one new recall action every week for an entire year from a single automaker. And this isn't new for Ford. Last year, in 2025, the company set what is now an official record, 152 separate safety recalls in a single year. To put that number in context, the previous record for any automaker in a single year belonged to General Motors, set back in 2014, and Ford didn't just break that record, it nearly doubled it. More than 24 million vehicles were recalled across the entire American auto industry that year. And over half of them, more than 13 million, were Fords or Lincolns. One company, half of every single recalled vehicle in the country. That is the scale we are talking about. Now, if this were happening quietly, in the background, without much public attention, that would be one thing. But it hasn't been quiet. Late in 2024, federal regulators actually fined Ford for failing to comply with recall requirements, essentially penalizing the company not just for having defects, but for how it was handling the process of fixing them. That is a serious signal. It means this wasn't simply a company that builds a lot of cars and therefore has a lot of recalls by sheer volume. Regulators were concerned enough about the pattern to take direct enforcement action. So how did Ford respond? In its own words, the company said its rising recall numbers actually reflected an intensive strategy to more quickly find and fix hardware and software issues, and to go the extra mile to protect customers. Ford has said it more than doubled its safety and technical expert teams, and significantly increased testing on critical vehicle systems, especially powertrains. In other words, Ford's official position is that the high recall numbers are not proof the cars are getting worse, but proof that the company is getting much more aggressive about catching problems early before they turn into serious accidents, injuries, or lawsuits. That is a reasonable explanation, and there is some truth buried inside it. Modern vehicles are more complicated than they have ever been. They are rolling computers, loaded with sensors, software modules, over-the-air update systems, and electronic components that didn't exist in cars a decade ago. More complexity generally does mean more potential points of failure, and more sophisticated detection tools mean more of those failures actually get caught and reported instead of quietly ignored. But that explanation only goes so far, because the sheer number and severity of some of these recalls goes beyond routine housekeeping. Let's walk through some of the actual issues, because the details matter here, and they tell a very different story than a simple headline number ever could. One of the largest recalls this year affected more than 4 million trucks, vans, and SUVs, including some of Ford's best-selling and most profitable vehicles, like the F-150, the Ford Maverick, the Ranger, and the Expedition, along with the Lincoln Navigator. The issue was a software bug in the integrated trailer module, the system responsible for managing lights and brakes when you have a trailer hooked up to your vehicle. If that software glitched, it could cause the trailer's brakes and turn signals to simply stop working while you were towing. If you have ever towed a boat, a camper, or a heavy trailer down the highway, you understand immediately why a failure like that is dangerous. Losing brake function on a trailer mid-drive isn't a minor inconvenience. It is a serious safety hazard for the driver and for everyone else on the road around them. Then there was the Bronco recall, covering vehicles going back to the 2021 model year, involving a component called the Accessory Protocol Interface module. If that module overheated, it could shut down entirely, and one of the consequences was that the rear-view camera image would simply stop displaying. No warning necessarily, just a dead screen where your backup camera used to be. More recently, and this one is particularly unsettling, Ford recalled close to 80,000 SUVs, specifically the Explorer and the Lincoln Aviator, because the driver's seat could recline on its own without anyone even sitting in it. Regulators found that this could happen when a driver remotely unlocked or remotely started the vehicle. The seat would move back unexpectedly, and if there happened to be a passenger sitting in the second row at the time, that reclining motion could actually pin them. Picture a parent remotely starting the car to warm it up before school pickup, with a child already buckled into the back seat, and the driver's seat suddenly sliding back into that child's space. That is the kind of scenario regulators are worried about, and it's why this recall exists. And this comes on top of earlier recalls in the same vehicle family for seats that could move unexpectedly on their own, and separate recalls addressing engine fire risks. This is not one isolated defect. It is a pattern of related seat and structural issues stacking up across the same core SUV lineup. There have also been recalls tied to windshield wiper motors, failing to function properly on Explorer and Escape SUVs, along with Lincoln Aviator and Corsair models, an issue that directly affects visibility in bad weather. There was a recall covering more than 1 million vehicles for rear-view cameras that would flip or invert the image when a driver shifted into reverse, effectively showing the world backwards at exactly the moment precision matters most. And on the electric vehicle side, Ford has had to recall electric F-150 Lightning trucks, along with the Mustang Mach-E and the Maverick, over a defect causing a loss of park function, meaning the vehicle could fail to properly stay in park, a serious safety concern for anyone who has ever parked on a hill or stepped away from their vehicle assuming it would stay put. Add all of this up, and you start to see why Ford's warranty costs have become such a significant financial burden. Industry analysts have pointed out that Ford's warranty expenses reached nearly 5% of its total revenue last year, noticeably higher than rival General Motors, whose warranty costs sat closer to 4% of revenue. That might not sound like a massive gap on paper, but when you're talking about a company generating tens of billions of dollars in revenue every quarter, even a single percentage point difference translates into hundreds of millions of dollars in additional cost every single year just to fix problems after the vehicles have already left the factory. So now you understand the recall side of the story, and it is genuinely serious. This is not manufactured outrage or clickbait exaggeration. The numbers are real. They are documented in federal safety databases, and they represent a real, ongoing quality control challenge for one of America's largest automakers. But now, let's flip to the other half of the story, the half that almost never gets mentioned in the same breath as all of those recall headlines, because it complicates the narrative that Ford is simply falling apart. At the end of July 2026, Ford reported its second quarter earnings, and the results genuinely surprised a lot of people on Wall Street. Adjusted earnings before interest and taxes came in at $2.5 billion for the quarter, up from $2.1 billion during the same quarter the year before. That is real growth in operating profitability, not just a one-time accounting trick. And based on that strength, Ford didn't just meet expectations, it raised its full-year profit guidance, moving its target range up from between $8.5 and $10.5 billion to a new range of $10 to $11 billion for the entire year. When a company raises its own guidance like that, it is essentially telling investors, we are more confident about the rest of this year than we were a few months ago. And that confidence sent Ford's stock jumping nearly 7% in after-hours trading, the moment the results were released. Now, it's true that Ford actually reported a net loss for the quarter, and if you stopped reading right there, you might think that confirms the collapse narrative. But the reason behind that net loss matters enormously. It wasn't caused by declining sales or a sudden operational crisis. It was driven by a one-time special charge of $4.2 billion tied directly to Ford unwinding its Blue Oval SK battery joint venture and canceling certain electric vehicle programs that were no longer expected to pay off. In other words, this was Ford taking a deliberate financial hit now, on paper, in order to stop pouring money into electric vehicle bets that weren't working, so that it could redirect resources toward the parts of the business that are actually profitable. That is a very different story than a company whose core operations are collapsing. It's closer to a company cutting its losses on a bad bet and taking the accounting pain up front, rather than continuing to bleed money slowly over several more years. Look at the underlying divisions, and the picture gets even clearer. Ford's traditional business, the internal combustion side of the company known internally as Ford Blue, earned $1.1 billion in profit for the quarter, up significantly from $661 million in the same quarter a year earlier. Ford Pro, the commercial vehicle and fleet business, still generated $1.7 billion in profit, even though that number was down from $2.3 billion the year before, mainly because of aluminum supply constraints that limited how many pickup trucks the company could actually build and sell. And on the electric vehicle side, known as Model E, losses actually shrank. The unit lost $919 million this quarter, which sounds bad until you compare it to the $1.3 billion loss from the same period last year. In other words, the EV division is still losing money, but it is losing significantly less money than it used to, which is generally seen as a sign of improving discipline rather than a business in free fall. Then there's the stock market's own verdict, which tends to be a pretty unforgiving judge of whether a company's story actually holds together. Ford stock has climbed more than 8% since the start of this year, comfortably ahead of General Motors, which is up around 6% over the same period, and dramatically ahead of Tesla, whose stock has actually fallen close to 30% this year. Let that sink in for a moment. T, the company at the center of a record-breaking recall crisis, is currently outperforming Tesla, the electric vehicle company that so many people assumed was years ahead on quality and technology. Ford shares even touched an all-time high back in May of this year, and while the stock has pulled back somewhat since then, it remains solidly ahead of where it started the years. And ahead of most of its direct competitors. Wall Street analysts have been paying attention too, and their actions speak louder than any single headline. One major investment bank upgraded Ford's stock rating from hold to buy and raised its price target from $15 a share up to $18. Another large bank maintained its already positive overweight rating and raised its own price target as well. These are not small, meaningless gestures. Professional analysts who study these companies for a living are literally telling their clients that they expect Ford stock to be worth more money in the near future, not less. At the exact same time, regulators are publishing recall notice after recall notice for millions of the very same vehicles those analysts are bullish on. So here is the real tension at the center of this entire story, the one almost nobody puts together clearly enough. Ford's quality control problems and Ford's financial performance are in many ways disconnected from each other in the short term. A recall costs money, sometimes a lot of money, in the form of parts, labor at dealerships, and reputational damage. But it doesn't necessarily stop people from buying new Ford trucks and SUVs today, and it doesn't necessarily stop Wall Street from valuing the company based on where profits are headed over the next year or two. Consumers, for the most part, are still buying pickup trucks because they need pickup trucks for work, for towing, for daily life. And Ford remains one of the biggest and most trusted names in that specific category, recalls or not. Investors, meanwhile, are looking at margins, pricing power, and the direction of profit. And right now, those numbers happen to be moving in a positive direction, even while the safety numbers are moving in a troubling one. That doesn't mean the recall crisis is something to brush aside. It absolutely is not. When you're talking about seats that can move and potentially pin a child, or trailer brakes that can silently fail while you're driving down the highway at 70 miles an hour, those are not minor inconveniences. Those are the kinds of defects that, in a worst-case scenario, lead to real injuries, real lawsuits, and real damage to a brand's reputation over the long run, even if that damage takes years to fully show up in the sales numbers. Reputation in the auto. Industry tends to move slowly. People don't necessarily abandon a brand the moment one negative headline appears. But patterns build over time, and if a company keeps setting recall records year after year after year, at some point that pattern starts to influence buying decisions in a much more serious way, especially among people cross-shopping between Ford, GM, Toyota, and other competitors who don't have nearly the same recall volume. There's also a deeper story here about where Ford's electric vehicle strategy is headed, because that part of the business tells you a lot about where the company sees its future. Ford's electric vehicle deliveries actually fell more than 40% year over year in the most recent quarter, dropping to fewer than 10,000 units sold in that period. At the same time, overall vehicle deliveries across the company were down about 10% compared to the year before, driven partly by discontinued models and a steep decline in daily rental fleet sales. So Ford is selling fewer vehicles overall right now, and dramatically fewer electric vehicles specifically, even as it earns more profit per vehicle sold. That tells you Ford has made a very deliberate strategic choice. Instead of chasing raw sales volume or aggressively pushing electric vehicles the way some competitors have, the company appears to be prioritizing profitability, focusing its energy and resources on the trucks, SUVs, and commercial vehicles that actually make the most money, while scaling back the electric vehicle bets that haven't been paying off the way the industry expected a few years ago. That is a very different company than the one people picture when they hear the phrase Ford is collapsing. A truly collapsing company doesn't usually raise its own profit guidance in the middle of the year. It doesn't usually get upgraded by major investment banks. It doesn't usually see its stock outperform Tesla and General Motors at the same time. What we're actually watching is a company managing two very different battles simultaneously. One battle is financial, and right now, Ford appears to be winning that battle, at least based on the numbers reported this year. The other battle is about manufacturing quality and consumer trust, and that battle is far from won. In fact, based purely on the recall numbers, you could argue Ford is currently losing that fight worse than almost any other major automaker in America. It's also worth stepping back and asking why this is happening to Ford specifically, and not equally across every automaker on the road. Part of the answer is simply the size and age of Ford's lineup. The company sells an enormous number of vehicles across an unusually wide range of platforms, many of which have been in production for years, carried forward with updates and modifications rather than being redesigned from scratch. The F-150, for example, is one of the best-selling vehicles in America year after year, which means any defect discovered in that truck's electronics or hardware doesn't just affect a small number of buyers, it potentially touches millions of vehicles built across several model years at once. A defect found in a low-volume vehicle from a smaller manufacturer might trigger a recall covering a few thousand cars. The exact same category of defect, found in something as widely produced as the F-150 or the Explorer, instantly becomes a headline making multi-million vehicle recall, simply because of how many of those vehicles exist on American roads. There's also the software question, and this is something that applies to the entire auto industry, not just Ford. Modern vehicles increasingly behave less like simple mechanical machines and more like computers on wheels, packed with dozens of interconnected control modules handling everything from the trailer brake lights to the position of your seat to the image displayed on your rear-view camera screen. That level of complexity creates more opportunities for something to go wrong, but it also creates opportunities to fix things remotely, through over-the-air software updates, without ever requiring a trip to the dealership. Ford has actually used this to its advantage in several of the recalls we've discussed, pushing wireless software fixes for issues like the trailer module problem, rather than requiring owners to bring their trucks in physically. That's a meaningful difference from the recall process of 20 years ago, when almost every fix meant scheduling a service appointment and losing use of your vehicle for a day. It doesn't eliminate the underlying problem of so many defects being found in the first place, but it does change how disruptive those fixes are for everyday owners. Compare this to Tesla for a moment, since the two companies get compared constantly in the media. Tesla issued only 11 recalls last year, covering about 745,000 vehicles, a tiny fraction of Ford's recall volume. Some of that gap comes down to simple math, since Tesla still sells far fewer vehicles overall than Ford does, and a smaller fleet naturally produces fewer recall actions. But some of it also reflects a genuinely different approach to releasing new technology, along with Tesla's heavy reliance on remote software updates that can sometimes resolve issues before they even rise to the level of a formal recall filing. Whatever the explanation. The contrast is striking, and it's part of why Ford's recall numbers stand out so dramatically against the rest of the industry, rather than blending into the general noise of routine automotive recalls that happen every year across every manufacturer. None of this erases the seriousness of what Ford is dealing with, but it does help explain why a company can be breaking recall records and beating earnings estimates during the exact same calendar year. Scale cuts both ways. The same massive production volume that makes Ford one of the most profitable and dominant truck makers in America is the same production volume that turns even a relatively contained defect into a headline about millions of recalled vehicles. Understanding that relationship between scale, complexity, and risk is really the missing piece that most coverage of this story leaves out entirely, focusing instead on whichever number sounds more dramatic in a headline, without connecting it to the bigger picture underneath. So if you're someone who already owns a Ford vehicle, what does all of this actually mean for you in practical terms? First, and this matters more than anything else in this entire video, keep track of official recall notices for your specific vehicle. You can check your vehicle identification number directly through Ford's own recall lookup tool, or through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's public database. Recall repairs are free. The dealership does not charge you for parts or labor on a recall repair because, by definition, a recall means the manufacturer has acknowledged a safety defect and is legally obligated to fix it at no cost to you. If you've received a recall notice and haven't taken your vehicle in yet, don't put it off, especially if the defect involves brakes, steering, seats, or anything related to fire risk. Some of these fixes are simple over-the-air software updates that take almost no time at all, while others require an actual visit to a dealership, But either way, ignoring the notice doesn't make the underlying defect go away. If you're currently shopping for a new vehicle and Ford is on your list, this doesn't necessarily mean you should cross the brand off entirely. Recalls, especially the kind triggered by proactive safety testing rather than actual accidents or injuries, can sometimes be a sign that a company is being aggressive about catching problems early, which is exactly the explanation Ford itself has offered. But it's absolutely reasonable to do your homework before buying, checking recall history for the specific model and model year you're interested in, reading how quickly and effectively Ford has resolved similar issues in the past, and weighing that against the reasons you were drawn to that vehicle in the first place. Whether that's towing capacity, price, styling, or brand loyalty built up over years or even generations within a family. And if you're simply someone following this story from the outside, maybe you don't even own a Ford, but you've seen the headlines and you're curious what's actually going on. The biggest lesson here isn't really about Ford specifically. It's about how easy it is for a single dramatic-sounding headline to completely miss the more complicated and more interesting reality underneath it. Ford is collapsing makes for a punchy headline and a great thumbnail. But it isn't actually true, at least not based on the financial evidence sitting in front of us right now. At the same time, ignoring the recall crisis entirely and only talking about the good earnings numbers would be just as dishonest, because that crisis is real, it's well documented, it's expensive, and it does represent a genuine risk to Ford's reputation over the coming years if the pattern continues. The truth, as it so often is with large, complicated companies, sits somewhere in the messy middle. Ford is making real money right now. Its stock is outperforming most of its direct competitors this year, and Wall Street analysts are growing more confident about where the company is headed financially. At the exact same time, Ford is dealing with one of the most serious and sustained quality control crises in its entire history, one that has already drawn direct scrutiny and financial penalties from federal safety regulators, and one that shows no clear signs of slowing down heading into the rest of this year. Both of those things are happening at once, inside the same company, during the exact same months. And understanding that contradiction, rather than picking one side of the story and ignoring the other, is really the only way to actually understand what's happening at Ford right now. If you found this breakdown useful, and you want to keep getting the real story behind the headlines instead of just the outrage or the hype, make sure you're subscribed, because there is a lot more happening in this industry over the next few months that is worth paying close attention to. And you will not want to miss how this particular story continues to unfold from here.